It was Tuesday, August 18th, 1940. The sun rose over the green fields of Surrey, England, casting long shadows across RAF Kenley airfield. The dew still clung to the grass runways, and the morning air carried the scent of summer flowers mixed with aviation fuel. To any casual observer, it might have seemed like just another peaceful English morning, but the men and women at this airfield knew better. They were living on borrowed time. RAF Kenley was no ordinary airfield. It was one of the crown jewels of Britain's air defense system, a sector station commanding several other airfields in the critical 11 Group area that protected London and the southeast. From its operations room buried beneath the ground, controllers directed squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires against the German raiders that came day after day, wave after wave, trying to break the Royal Air Force and clear the skies for Hitler's invasion of Britain. For nearly 6 weeks, the Battle of Britain had raged across the summer skies. The Luftwaffe had started with attacks on shipping convoys, then moved to coastal radar stations, and now, in mid-August, they were focusing their fury on the fighter airfields themselves. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler he would destroy the RAF in just 4 days. That deadline had long passed, but the pressure was mounting. The stakes couldn't be higher. If the RAF fell, Britain would fall. If Britain fell, Nazi Germany would dominate all of Europe. At Kenley, the personnel were exhausted. Pilots were flying 3, 4, sometimes 5 sorties a day. Ground crews worked around the clock to repair damaged aircraft, patch bullet holes, replace shattered canopies, and reload ammunition belts. The WAAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force members, plotted raids on maps, answered telephones, and kept the complex machinery of air defense running. Everyone knew they were outnumbered. Everyone knew the Germans had more planes, more pilots, more of everything. But they also knew they were fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence as a free nation. The breakfast tables that morning were quiet. Tired men ate their eggs and bacon, drank their tea, and tried not to think about what the day might bring. Some wrote letters home. Others played cards or tried to catch a few minutes of sleep. The pilots of 615 Squadron and 64 Squadron, based at Kenley, checked their aircraft and waited. They always waited. That was the hardest part. The waiting. Not knowing when the scramble bell would ring, not knowing if this would be the day they wouldn't come back. But August 18th would be different. This day would go down in history as one of the most ferocious days of the entire Battle of Britain. And for RAF Kenley, it would be the hardest fought day of all. Across the English Channel at airfields in occupied France, the Luftwaffe was preparing something special. The Germans had learned that attacking British fighter stations was costly. The RAF pilots fought with desperate courage over their own bases, and the anti-aircraft defenses were formidable. But the Luftwaffe High Command believed they had found the solution: a low-level surprise attack. The plan was audacious, risky, and potentially devastating. Oberst Johannes Fink, commander of Kampfgeschwader 76, had been given a critical mission: destroy RAF Kenley. Not just damage it, destroy it completely. Put it out of action for weeks or months. Without Kenley, the entire defensive system for South London would be crippled. German bombers would have a clear path to the capital. KG-76 was equipped with Dornier Du 17 bombers, nicknamed flying pencils for their sleek, narrow fuselages. These aircraft weren't the most powerful bombers in the Luftwaffe arsenal, but they were fast and nimble. For this mission, 9 Du-17s from the 9th Staffel would fly at treetop level across the Channel and southern England, staying below British radar, guided by specially prepared maps and photographs of the target. They would arrive at Kenley without warning, drop their bombs from just above ground level for maximum accuracy, and escape before the defenders knew what hit them. The bomber crews were briefed at dawn. They studied aerial photographs that showed every building, every hangar, every detail of Kenley airfield. Their targets were marked: the operations room, the hangars, the fuel dumps, the ammunition stores, the barracks. Each bomber carried a deadly cargo of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries designed to turn the airfield into an inferno. But the low-level raid was just part of the plan. To ensure its success, the Germans organized a massive diversion. High-altitude bomber formations, escorted by fighters, would attack other airfields in the region at exactly the same time. British radar would see these formations and scramble fighters to intercept them. By the time anyone realized the real danger, The low-level raiders would already be over Kenley. Leading the low-level attack was Hauptmann Joachim Roth, a veteran pilot with ice in his veins. He had flown in the Spanish Civil War in Poland and France. He knew his business, but he also knew this mission was different. Flying at 50 feet or lower over enemy territory in broad daylight was practically suicide. One moment of distraction, one slight miscalculation, and his bomber would cartwheel into the ground in a ball of flame. And even if they survived the approach, they'd have to fly through murderous ground fire as they attacked, then escape with every British fighter in the area chasing them. At 12:50 p.m., the engines roared to life. One by one, the 9 Dorniers lifted off from their French airfield and formed up low over the channel. Behind them, the diversionary forces, more than 100 bombers and fighters, climbed to altitude and headed north. The greatest air raid against a single RAF station was underway. The crossing was tense. The pilots flew just above the wave tops, so low that spray from the water occasionally hit their windscreens. Radio silence was absolute. They navigated by dead reckoning and visual landmarks, following railway lines and roads that snaked through the English countryside. German intelligence had done its work well. The maps were accurate, the route carefully planned to avoid known anti-aircraft batteries and observation posts. As they crossed the English coast near Beachy Head, one pilot whispered a prayer. The green fields of Sussex spread before them, deceptively peaceful. Cows grazed in meadows. Cars moved along country lanes. People went about their daily business, unaware that death was screaming toward them at 250 miles per hour. Inside the Dornier, bomb aimers lay in the glazed noses, watching the ground rush past in a blur. Gunners swiveled their weapons nervously, scanning the sky for fighters. Pilots gripped their controls, flying by instinct, threading between trees and hills, staying invisible, staying alive. They were 20 minutes from Kenley, 20 minutes from hell. At RAF Kenley, the first warning came at 1 p.m. The operations room received reports of large German formations approaching from the south. Sector controllers studied their plotting tables, watching as WAAFs moved markers representing enemy aircraft across the map. It looked like another high-altitude raid, probably targeting one of the nearby airfields. The scramble bell rang. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft, pulling on helmets and parachutes as they ran. Hurricanes and Spitfires burst into life, propellers spinning into transparent discs. Within minutes, squadrons were airborne, climbing hard to intercept the raiders. But something felt wrong. The German formation was splitting up, heading toward multiple targets. The controllers redirected fighters, trying to cover all possible threats. In the confusion, nobody noticed 9 tiny dots racing across Surrey at ground level, hidden in the radar's blind spot. At 1:22 p.m., a soldier manning an observation post near Red Hill looked up from his lunch and froze. German bombers were coming straight at him, so low he could see the pilots' faces. He grabbed his telephone and screamed a warning into it. Enemy aircraft approaching Kenley at 0 feet. The message reached Kenley's operations room at 1:23 p.m. The duty officer's blood ran cold. There was no time to sound the air raid siren, no time to get people to shelter. He grabbed the microphone for the airfield's public address system and shouted, "Take cover. Take cover. Enemy aircraft overhead." Personnel scattered in all directions. Some threw themselves into trenches. Others dove under buildings or into doorways. Ground crews tried to push aircraft into the protection of sandbag revetments, but there wasn't time. The Dorniers were already there. Hauptmann Roth pulled his bomber into a slight climb to clear the aerodrome boundary. For a few seconds, Kenley Airfield spread before him like a map, every target exactly where the reconnaissance photos had shown it. He saw the hangars, the parked aircraft, the fuel bowsers, the administration buildings. He saw people running. He gave the order, "Bombs away." The first bombs fell at 1:23 p.m. High explosives and incendiaries rained down on Kenley with devastating accuracy. A hangar erupted in a massive explosion that sent a mushroom cloud of smoke and flame hundreds of feet into the air. Parked aircraft disintegrated. A fuel dump exploded with a roar that shattered windows a mile away. The ground heaved and buckled as 500-pound bombs cratered the landing field. But the defenders fought back with savage determination. Anti-aircraft guns that had been positioned around the airfield opened fire, filling the air with red and white tracers. A parachute and cable device, a last-ditch defense system that fired cables on small rockets into the path of low-flying aircraft, launched into the sky. One Dornier flew directly into the cables. They wrapped around the bomber's wing and tail, the parachutes acting like anchors. The aircraft heeled over violently and crashed into the ground just beyond the airfield boundary, exploding an orange fireball. All 4 crew members were killed instantly. Machine gun fire crackled from every direction. Soldiers fired rifles at the bombers. Men with nothing but small arms blazed away in defiance, knowing it was probably futile but unable to simply stand and watch. One WAAF, Corporal Josie Robbins, stayed at her post in the operations block even as bombs exploded around the building, calmly continuing to plot enemy aircraft positions while plaster dust fell from the ceiling and the lights flickered. A second Dornier, piloted by Unteroffizier Wilhelm Friedrich Ilg, took a direct hit from anti-aircraft fire. The shell tore through the bomber's fuselage, killing the radio operator instantly and starting a fire in the bomb bay. Ilg fought desperately to keep the crippled aircraft airborne. He couldn't gain altitude, the engines were failing, smoke pouring from the port motor. He had only seconds before the fire reached the fuel tanks. He saw a field ahead and put the bomber down in a controlled crash landing. The Dornier skidded across the grass, shedding parts, and finally came to rest on its belly. The crew scrambled out and ran clear just before the remaining bombs cooked off in the fire. They were captured minutes later by British soldiers. A third Dornier, badly damaged by ground fire, limped away trailing smoke. It would crash into the sea on the return journey. The entire attack lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes of absolute hell. When the surviving Dornier screamed away to the south, Kenley was burning. Smoke billowed thousands of feet into the air. Hangars were demolished. 10 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Fuel fires raged out of control. Craters pocked the landing field. Buildings were collapsed or burning. Dead and wounded lay scattered across the station. But amid the devastation, something remarkable happened. Within minutes of the attack, ground crews were already working to fill in craters. Fire crews battled the blazes. Medical personnel tended to the wounded. And in the operations room, deep underground and undamaged, the controllers never stopped working. The heart of Kenley was still beating. As ground crews at Kenley fought fires and dragged wounded comrades to safety, the second wave of attackers was approaching. This time there would be no surprise. At 1:40 p.m., radar operators tracked a massive formation of German bombers crossing the coast. 27 Dornier Do-17s from KG-76, flying at 12,000 feet, escorted by scores of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. Their target, RAF Kenley. The German High Command wanted to make absolutely certain Kenley was destroyed. The low-level raid had been bold and devastating, but follow-up was essential to finish the job. These high-altitude bombers would crater any runways the first wave had missed, destroy any buildings still standing, and prevent British crews from repairing the damage. But this time the RAF was ready. Fighter squadrons that had been scrambled during the initial attack were now vectored onto the incoming bombers. Squadron leader Mike Crossley, leading 32 Squadron Flying Hurricanes, spotted the German formation first. The bombers flew in tight, disciplined formations. Vics of 3 aircraft stepped up and staggered so that their defensive guns could support each other. Around them, the yellow-nosed Bf-109s weaved and circled, waiting for the British fighters. Crossley didn't hesitate.
He called out, "Tally-ho!"
"Going in!" and led his squadron into the attack. The Hurricanes dove on the bombers from above and behind, the classic bounce. The air exploded with gunfire. For the bomber crews, it was terrifying. The Hurricanes came in fast, their 8 machine guns spitting flame. Bullets ripped through aluminum skin, shattered perspex, tore through fuel tanks and engines. A Dornier in the leading formation staggered as rounds from a Hurricane stitched across its cockpit. The pilot slumped forward, dead or unconscious. The bomber fell out of formation, beginning a long spiral toward the ground, but the Germans didn't break. Bomb aimers lay in their glass noses, trying to line up on the target while fighters attacked and the aircraft bucked and weaved with evasive maneuvers. Gunners fired back desperately, trying to drive off the attacking Hurricanes. Messerschmitt 109s pounced on the British fighters, and suddenly the sky was a churning mass of aircraft, all trying to kill each other. Pilot Officer Humphrey Russell of 615 Squadron, flying a Hurricane, found himself surrounded by 109s. He twisted and turned, trying to shake them off, but tracer fire flashed past his canopy. A shell smashed into his engine, which seized instantly. Smoke poured into the cockpit. Russell had no choice. He rolled the Hurricane inverted and fell out, tumbling through the air before pulling his ripcord. His parachute blossomed just as his aircraft exploded below him. He would land in a field near Kenley, bruised but alive. Despite the ferocious opposition, the German bombers pressed on. They had their orders: destroy Kenley. At 1:43 p.m., the lead bombardier called bombs away, and the first stick of bombs tumbled from the Dorniers. The other bombers followed suit. Hundreds of bombs fell toward the already burning airfield. The men and women at Kenley heard them coming, a rising shriek that grew louder and louder until it seemed to fill the entire world. Then the explosions began again. The ground heaved. More buildings collapsed. More craters appeared. A direct hit on a trench shelter killed 6 soldiers instantly. The station's sick quarters took a direct hit, but miraculously the patients and medical staff had already evacuated to a safer location. But the price the Germans paid was terrible. British fighters tore into the bomber formations with suicidal courage. Sergeant Harry Newton of 111th Squadron pressed his attack so close to a Dornier that he could see the German rear gunner's face, twisted in fear, before his guns fell silent forever. The bomber caught fire and began to fall, pieces breaking away as it plummeted. Another Dornier, hit by anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks, struggled to stay in formation. The pilot, his instruments shattered, his co-pilot wounded, somehow kept flying, but over Croydon, just north of Kenley, the bomber finally gave up. It fell into a residential street, exploding on impact and destroying several houses. Incredibly, the crew survived and were pulled from the wreckage by civilians and police. By 1:50 p.m. it was over. The surviving German bombers turned for home, harried all the way to the coast by British fighters. Behind them, Kenley burned more fiercely than ever. From the air, it looked completely destroyed, a smoking ruin that would take weeks to repair. But looks were deceiving. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that RAF Kenley's most important asset was still fully operational. Deep underground, protected by tons of concrete and earth, the operations room was undamaged. The telephone lines had been cut by bombs, but emergency radio links were working. And most critically, the morale of the men and women at Kenley was unbroken. As the last German bombers disappeared from view, Station Commander Wing Commander Thomas Prickman emerged from a shelter and surveyed the devastation. His airfield looked like a moonscape. Fires burned everywhere. Buildings were rubble. Aircraft were twisted wreckage. The casualties were significant, 10 dead, many wounded. Any reasonable person would have declared the station out of action. Prickman wasn't a reasonable person. He was a RAF officer, and RAF officers didn't give up. He immediately called a meeting of his senior officers and told them flatly, "We're getting this airfield operational. Now." What followed was one of the most remarkable recovery efforts of the entire Battle of Britain. Ground crews, many of them injured, went to work immediately. They filled bomb craters with rubble and earth, tamping it down to create a usable surface. They pushed damaged aircraft out of the way. They fought fires. They cleared runways of debris. They jury-rigged electrical systems and communications lines. They did whatever it took. The WAAFs in the operations room never stopped working. With telephones out, they passed messages by runner to nearby RAF stations. They tracked incoming German raids and vectored fighters to intercept them. One WAAF, Sergeant Elizabeth Mortimer, worked for 18 hours straight without a break, coordinating the defense of the sector even as repair crews worked above her head to shore up the damaged operations block. By 3 p.m., less than 2 hours after the first attack, a Hurricane landed on Kenley's cratered field. The pilot, who had been scrambled from a nearby airfield, needed to refuel. Ground crews swarmed over the aircraft, refueling it by hand with buckets and hoses since the fuel system had been damaged. The pilot took off again 15 minutes later to rejoin the battle. By 5 p.m., Kenley was declared operational for emergency landings. By the next morning, fighters were being scrambled from the base again. It was an incredible achievement, but the day's fighting wasn't over yet. At 6 p.m., exhausted personnel at Kenley heard the air raid sirens wailing again. German bombers were returning for a third attack. This time, every fighter that could get airborne was scrambled. Damaged aircraft that could fly were pressed into service. Pilots who had already flown multiple sorties climbed back into their cockpits and took off again. Flight Lieutenant James Ginger Lacey of 501 Squadron was one of them. He had already shot down 2 German aircraft that day, and his Hurricane was patched with fabric and glue from previous damage. But when the scramble came, he didn't hesitate. He took off from Kenley's cratered runway, the Hurricane bouncing over rough ground, and climbed to intercept. At 15,000 feet, he found them, a formation of Heinkel He-111 bombers, lumbering toward London with their deadly cargo. Lacey attacked head-on, the classic fighter tactic that disrupted German formations and tested nerves. His guns hammered, and the lead Heinkel staggered, smoke pouring from an engine. The bomber formation broke up, scattering across the sky. Other fighters joined the attack. The sky filled with darting Hurricanes and Spitfires, turning and diving, guns flashing. German gunners fired back, filling the air with tracers. One Spitfire was hit and fell away, the pilot bailing out. But the bomber raid was broken up. Most of the Heinkels jettisoned their bombs early and turned for home. Kenley had survived. Against all odds, despite being hit by two of the most concentrated air raids of the entire Battle of Britain, the airfield remained operational. The operations room continued to function. Fighters continued to fly. The Germans had thrown everything at Kenley and failed to knock it out of the battle. As darkness fell on August 18, 1940, the men and women of RAF Kenley took stock. The airfield was a disaster zone. 12 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. 4 hangars were completely destroyed, others badly damaged. The officers' mess, the station sick quarters, workshops, stores, all were rubble. 10 personnel were dead, with many more wounded. But worse than the material damage was the psychological toll. These were young men and women, many still teenagers, who had been through an experience of unimaginable intensity. They had been bombed, strafed, and attacked repeatedly. They had seen friends killed and maimed. They had felt the earth shake beneath them and heard the screams of the dying. Corporal Josie Robbins, the WAAF who had stayed at her post throughout the first attack, sat quietly in a corner of the operations room, shaking. She had maintained perfect composure during the raid, but now, with the immediate danger past, the reaction set in. A medical officer found her and gently led her to the sick bay, where she was given hot tea and a sedative. She would be back at her post the next morning. The pilots were utterly exhausted. Some had flown 5 sorties that day, taking off, fighting, landing to refuel and rearm, then immediately taking off again. Their hands shook with fatigue. Their nerves were shot, but they gathered in what remained of the mess, drinking tea or something stronger, and talking quietly about the day's fighting. Flight Lieutenant Tom Greer of 615 Squadron was missing. He had been shot down by a Messerschmitt 109 over the channel and was presumed killed. He had been at Kenley for only 3 weeks. Nobody knew his family or where they lived. Someone would have to write to them, tell them their son was gone. It was one of the hardest parts of command. But there were also small triumphs to celebrate. The squadron had claimed 7 confirmed kills and several probables. German aircraft had been shot down all across southern England. The Luftwaffe had paid a terrible price for their attacks. Across the channel, the German crews were having their own reckoning. Of the 9 Dorniers that had attacked at low level, 3 had been lost and 2 more were so badly damaged they'd never fly again. 50% casualties, an unsustainable loss rate. The high-altitude raid had lost 4 bombers shot down, with several more crash landing in France. Hauptmann Joachim Roth, who had led the low-level attack, made it back to France, but his bomber was riddled with holes. He climbed out of the cockpit, pulled off his helmet, and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He had seen one of his comrades crash in flames over Kenley. He had felt his own aircraft shudder as British bullets tore through it. He had flown through a curtain of tracers that seemed impossible to survive. He knew they had damaged Kenley badly, but at what cost? German intelligence would report Kenley as destroyed and out of action for weeks. But German intelligence was wrong. Within 24 hours, Kenley was back in full operation. The communications were restored, the runways were patched, and fighters were flying from the base as if nothing had happened. This was the true victory, not just surviving the attack, but bouncing back so quickly that the enemy's sacrifice had been in vain. The Germans had thrown their best punch, and Kenley had taken it and kept fighting. In the days following the raid, the full story of heroism at Kenley began to emerge. It wasn't just the pilots who had fought so bravely, it was everyone. The ground crew who had stayed at their posts under bombing and strafing, the WAAFs who had kept the operations room functioning, the anti-aircraft gunners who had brought down German bombers. the medical personnel who had worked under fire to save the wounded, the firefighters who had battled infernos while bombs exploded around them. Sergeant Elizabeth Mortimer was awarded the Military Medal for her courage and dedication in keeping the operations room functioning throughout the attacks. Corporal Josie Robbins received a commendation. Several of the anti-aircraft gunners were decorated for their actions in shooting down low-flying bombers, but perhaps the most remarkable story was that of WAAF Sergeant Joan Mortimer, no relation to Elizabeth. She had been in one of the above-ground buildings when the first attack struck. A bomb hit nearby, collapsing part of the structure. Joan was buried under rubble with a broken leg and several other injuries. She could hear people screaming, smell smoke and burning. Trapped in darkness, she could have given in to panic. Instead, she began singing, loudly. Music hall songs, patriotic songs, anything she could think of. Rescue workers digging frantically through the debris followed the sound of her voice and found her. They pulled her out broken but alive and still singing. She spent 3 months in hospital but eventually returned to duty at Kenley. She would serve throughout the war and live to be 94 years old, forever proud of her part in the battle. The pilots, too, became legends. Flight Lieutenant James Ginger Lacey would go on to become one of the top aces of the Battle of Britain, with 18 confirmed kills. He survived the war and lived to old age, always modest about his achievements but fiercely proud of his squadron and his service. Squadron leader Mike Crossley, who had led 32 Squadron into battle against the high-altitude bombers, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He would continue to fly combat missions throughout the war, eventually rising to the rank of Air Commodore. But not all stories had happy endings. Flight Lieutenant Tom Greer, initially listed as missing, was eventually confirmed dead. His body washed ashore 2 weeks after the battle. He was buried with full military honors in a small cemetery in Kent. His parents attended, elderly and grief-stricken, struggling to understand why their only son had to die. The squadron sent representatives, fellow pilots who had flown with Tom, who knew him as a friend, who would never forget him. This was the reality of the Battle of Britain. Glory and tragedy intertwined, heroism purchased at a terrible price. For every victory there was loss. For every medal there were funerals. The pilots knew they were living on borrowed time. The average life expectancy of a fighter pilot during the height of the battle was just 4 weeks. Yet they kept flying. Every morning they climbed into their Hurricanes and Spitfires and took to the skies, knowing the odds, knowing the risks, but doing it anyway. Because someone had to. Because if they didn't, Britain would fall and everything they loved would be destroyed. August 18, 1940 became known in RAF history as the hardest day of the Battle of Britain. It wasn't the single bloodiest day, that would come later, but in terms of the intensity of combat, the number of raids, the ferocity of the fighting, and the sheer determination displayed by both sides, it stood out. For RAF Kenley specifically, the raid was both a near catastrophe and a triumph. The airfield had been hit harder than any other RAF station in a single day. The damage was extensive. The casualties were significant. But the base had survived, and more than that, it had bounced back with incredible speed. This resilience became a symbol of Britain's determination to fight on no matter what. The Luftwaffe learned painful lessons that day. Low-level surprise attacks could be devastatingly effective, but the casualties were unsustainable. You couldn't win an air war by trading bombers for damaged runways that would be repaired in hours. The RAF's ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting was far greater than German intelligence had estimated. More importantly, the Germans were beginning to realize that their strategy wasn't working. They had been attacking RAF airfields for weeks, claiming huge numbers of British fighters destroyed. Yet every day RAF fighters rose to meet them in seemingly undiminished numbers. Where were all these fighters coming from? How could the British still be fighting? The answer was simple. British aircraft production was outpacing losses, new pilots were being trained to replace casualties, and the RAF had a depth of reserves the Germans hadn't anticipated. Most critically, the British were fighting over their own territory. A German pilot shot down over England was captured. A British pilot shot down over England could be back in the air the next day. This arithmetic of attrition favored the defense. By early September, Frustrated by their inability to destroy the RAF, the Germans would shift strategy. Instead of attacking airfields, they would begin the Blitz, terror bombing of London and other cities. This was actually a strategic mistake that gave the RAF time to recover and rebuild. The Battle of Britain would continue until late October, when Hitler finally postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The invasion would never come. Britain had held, and RAF Kenley had played its part in that victory. Today, visitors to what is now Kenley Aerodrome can still see reminders of that desperate day in August 1940. Some of the original buildings survive, pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel damage. The underground operations room has been preserved as a museum. Memorials commemorate those who died defending the airfield, and every year on August 18th, a small ceremony is held to remember the hardest-fought day. The lessons of Kenley extend beyond military history. The story is fundamentally about resilience, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things under extreme pressure. The WAAFs who stayed at their posts under bombing. The ground crew who repaired aircraft while fires burned around them. The pilots who flew sortie after sortie despite exhaustion and fear. The commanders who refused to give up even when their base was in ruins. These were not supermen or superwomen. They were just people, most of them very young, who found themselves in a situation where everything depended on them doing their duty. And they did it. Not because they were fearless, many of them were terrified, but because they believed in what they were fighting for. There's a photograph from RAF Kenley taken on the evening of August 18th. It shows a group of pilots sitting on the wing of a Hurricane, looking at the camera. They're dirty and exhausted, their flight suits stained with oil and sweat. Some are bandaged, but they're smiling. Not triumphant smiles, there was nothing to be triumphant about, but quiet smiles of men who have been through hell and come out the other side still intact, still together, still ready to fight. That photograph captures something essential about the Battle of Britain and about RAF Kenley's role in it. It wasn't about glory or heroics. It was about endurance, about getting up every morning and doing the job that needed to be done, no matter how hard, no matter how dangerous, because the alternative was unthinkable. When Winston Churchill famously said of the Battle of Britain pilots, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," he was thinking of days like August 18th, days when the few stood between civilization and tyranny, days when airfields like Kenley bore the full weight of Nazi Germany's fury and refused to break. The men and women who defended RAF Kenley on that August day in 1940 are mostly gone now. But their legacy endures. They proved that determination and courage can overcome superior numbers and firepower. They proved that free people fighting for their homes are nearly impossible to defeat. And they proved that even in the darkest hours, hope survives. RAF Kenley was not destroyed on August 18th, 1940. It survived, and Britain survived, and that made all the difference in the world. The hardest-fought day was over, but the battle would continue. The pilots would fly again tomorrow. The ground crew would repair more aircraft. The WAAFs would plot more raids. The people of Britain would endure more bombing, more rationing, more years of war. But they had proven something that day at Kenley. They had proven they could not be broken, and in the end that was enough. The sun set on the smoking ruins of RAF Kenley on August 18th, 1940. But by morning, the base was operational again. And that small miracle, repeated at airfields across southern England, day after day, week after week, saved a nation and changed the course of history. This was the hardest-fought day. And Britain won.